Greetings and welcome to the third video in this graphic design history short presentation. So last time we talked about typography, specifically how the humanist type sort of came into play as opposed to the Gothic script with regards to medieval manuscripts and development. So today we're going to be going over medieval manuscripts and Chinese manuscripts, because what many people don't realize is that the medieval period of Europe, while we were developing medieval manuscripts, over in China they were developing their version of the manuscripts, and today we're just going to be looking at the differences between the two of them and how it really relates to what we look at with design etiquette and such today. So first, let's lay some groundwork with the medieval manuscripts. So medieval manuscripts are sort of an iconic piece to medieval art. They have very, very well-defined art in the margins. They are extremely well-known and instantly recognizable. One example being the Book of Kells, which was developed in Ireland, and the Irish sort of herald it as one of their prized national treasures and is held in one of their largest art museums there. So these things are made, they take a while. They took an exceptionally long time, several years in fact, to fully commission one due to all the art and lettering and such that went into them. However, there is something that all these manuscripts sort of have in common, despite how different they are. One of the standards is what we call the 1, 2, 3, 4 margin. So if any of you know about books and book development, you have the gutter, which is the space in between the two pages. So if you open up a book, inside the middle of the fold, there's the gutter. All these medieval manuscripts had a 1-inch gap in the gutter, which means 1 inch away from the inside was where your text went. From the top portion of the book, there would be 2 inches. There would be 3 inches of space away from the edge of the page, and then 4 inches from the bottom. Now you might be wondering why they did that. It was mostly so that the 4 inches at the bottom was because if you look at how Bibles are read in churches and such, they're held at an angle on a platform that's holding them, and so you put your hands down on top of them while you're turning pages. So they did this so that you'd have ample hand space on the bottom of the page so you can get into it and read it and turn the pages easily. Same thing with why there was a large margin on the sides and tops, because people tend to flip pages from the right hand or bottom and sometimes the top. So that's why they put those margins in. But what this led to is that the space that you had to put text in was very, very condensed. And so the actual spot where you'd have text in was fairly small, which fed into the previous issue of why it was very hard to read in Gothic when it was so condensed into this small area. But another thing that this happened was that you had this whole extra space that you could put artwork and illustrations in. So the monks that did these illustrations had a lot of free space and a lot of free time in between letting the ink dry, that they thought, let's just do art, let's just draw whatever. And I do quite mean draw whatever. Some of the imagery in these medieval manuscripts is quite odd. Some very historical examples is a knight who's riding on top of a snail. There's one in which a person is picking fruit from a tree and the fruit are all phalluses. And there's a lot of weird imagery that is put into here. It really was much like, compared to modern day, a sketchbook for us. You know, we just draw random stuff in there and it would come out fine and such. So we had a lot. They had a lot to of freedom and time to do these really interesting artwork and sketches in them, and they came out absolutely beautiful. So those are the basics of the medieval manuscript that we've come to know. And then we get onto the Chinese manuscripts, and these is they get very different. So they had quite a few of them didn't have as much illustrations. You can sort of compare that medieval manuscripts, a good, I would say 50 to 60% of the page were the small illustrations and coloring and such, whereas here it was more so that it would be about 20%. of there. So there was no margin requirement due to them being set up in scrolls and rolled papers, so there was no margins for flipping through books. So they were filled to the brim with the Chinese lettering. However, that didn't mean that they didn't put in illustrations. They did put them in, and when they did put in these illustrations, they were absolutely incredible. Some of these illustrations took up over 60%, and it's one solid illustration to go along with. And these were very intricate, very beautiful, and we'll go into why they look this way as opposed to medieval manuscripts. So, these were both manuscripts made around the same time period, or at the very least had enough similarities that we can compare them to each other. And the main reason why it's important to compare these two is because both of these did something for graphic design today in terms of what they did. So we'll talk about, first we're going to talk about the materials. So you need to know a little bit about the basics of these manuscripts. So the scribes in medieval Europe used parchment made from sheepskin. And the reason for that is because sheepskin was a bit more expensive but really, really durable. Like if you look at the medieval manuscripts we have today from that time period, they're hold up very well. The ink and such still stays in fairly well. So they are very durable sheepskin, while expensive. Made it so that way these would last a long time. So, however, because of the high price and the fact that the church had the only sort of interest, or really the church was the only people who commissioned these books, and they were very exacting with their criteria, these two factors meant that manuscripts took a very long time to make, some of them taking as long as several years due to the exacting standards and having to make sure that the sheepskin you got was processed in the right way. By the contrast with the Chinese, they had invented paper, and we talked about this before with the Sumerian one, briefly in the Sumerian video, but the Chinese invented paper, which was cheap, it was simple to print, type in images on, it held up really relatively well, but it was incredibly widespread in China. And despite the fact that it was less durable and didn't have as much of a texture as the sheepskin parchment, the sheer nature of how cheap it was to make and how much you could mass manufacture meant that when it came to Europe, it just stormed the market, and people started printing these manuscripts and books on paper. So, in regards to the medieval manuscript, with how they were actually made, all the medieval manuscripts, text and image, were handmade. Every letter, every small knight with a snail, all of it was carefully painted by hand by a scribe sitting in a cold room next to a small heater. This, more than any other reason, accounted for the extremely long periods of time for the manuscripts to be released. The Chinese, however, developed a form of movable type. Now, we'll cover this in a future lecture when we talk about Hans Gutenberg, but movable type was essentially, they would have the wood block of their character, they would stamp it on ink, and they would press it, making the letter. And so if you got a whole row of them and aligned them with how you want, and then rolled ink over it and pressed it, you were able to make a full sentence, for example, or a full word, bit by bit. And so the fact that they had developed this method meant that they could mass produce quite a bit of it. So this accounts for the reason why many of the manuscripts that we find have large amounts of type in them. But when we go to the Chinese manuscript that had those huge images that I mentioned before, how do they do that? Some were hand painted. You could definitely find the artist willing to do a fairly large painting for theirs. But the images, some of the other large images, were made with the Chinese method of woodblock printing. So what is woodblock printing? Well, woodblock printing is where you carve an image into the piece of wood. This is paraphrasing it very heavily, but you carve an image into the piece of wood, and then you take a roller and apply paint over the carving. Then once it's there, you take the paper and then press it on top, and then you take usually like a stone or another piece of wood and then press it down on top of it until it sort of prints on. Then you remove it, and that is the Chinese art. Now this sounds very familiar to printing, with how we do it with some other types of printing, and it is very much this exact same way. And in a future video, we'll talk about the evolution of printing from the printing press to lithography and such like that. But this is a very rudimentary and early method of printing. Now, what this meant was that you could do small to very large illustrations and then paste it on. But the reason why we don't see a lot of large illustrations, in my mind anyway, is that you'd have to spend the time to carve out the full image, and if there was one mistake, you'd have to redo the whole thing. Much like how the reason why we don't get a lot of text in medieval manuscripts and why they took so long was that you made a mistake on a single, text piece, and then you have to redo the whole page. Whereas with the illustrations, they were small enough that if you messed up, you could just keep it in and it just look a little bit weird. But for the Chinese manuscripts, with how large these images were, you mess up on enough small details, and the entire thing gets ruined. So this was a short compare and contrast on the medieval manuscript and the Chinese manuscript. This is going to play into part later with how we're going to go over their development of type, or not so much type, but the development of methods of making type. So we will be talking about Hans Gutenberg, hopefully next, and the reason why I brought up Chinese manuscripts was because he took heavy inspiration from the Chinese after we established trade with them. So I hope you enjoyed this little history lesson.